I'm just a girl with a microphone, a YouTube channel, and a notes app, and we're going to talk about romantasy. It seemed like a lot of you liked my last video essay-ish thing where I shat on the publishing industry and just how white everything is. And if you want to go watch that, go check it out down below. There were so many lovely comments on that video, and honestly, I just need to say thank you to all of you because you were amazing. I love the discussions that we were having in the comments, and I hope that there will be similar discussions in the comments of this video. The last video, I feel like I had a lot to say just because I also have a background in publishing. I worked in publishing, and now I have my own publishing imprint, and I have been in the book community for a really long time. But today's topic is romantasy, and I kind of had the idea for this video as I was watching this video sort of podcast that my partner had sent me about how all the women are reading like fairy porn and dragon porn and whatever else in romantasy books and are wanting to spice up their sex lives in their marriages or in their relationships, which I thought was funny and interesting. And I feel like this is a topic that has come up a lot. And I feel like from the male point of view, this is like such a hot topic, I feel like, because they're just so shocked. And it's this idea of women turning to books for their form of what a, man might do with porn. I do feel like that's a little bit reductive, but there is an element of that to romantasy and to the smutty romances that, we read and consume. And let me just say here, I love romance. I am not a big romantasy reader. I've read a few and I've not really liked what I've seen. However, I don't think that the genre as a whole deserves all of the shitting on it that happens, but I do think that there are a few things that people don't really talk about in regards to romantasy. There's a lot of focus on this concept of it being female-centric, of it being, smutty, of it being fairy porn, and just everyone focusing on like the sexual aspect of it, even though a lot of romantasies actually don't have that much sex. Even the most popular ones like Fourth Wing and ACOTAR, which I have read part of Fourth Wing, and I have read the entire original series of ACOTAR way back when it came out in 2015 when it was still marketed as a YA fantasy. And honestly, neither of those books has that much explicit sex, at least the first ACOTAR book. So it's interesting to see how much people associate romantasy with smut, with porn, with this concept of it just being like absolute drivel. And there are elements to romantasy that I think are really strong. There's elements where women feel more empowered by some of these stories, but it's also interesting to see how there is these weird sort of justifications for love interests in these books. There is this concept of, being in love with morally gray characters in books, but really he's just a person with really shitty actions and behaviors, but it's all explained away because he has trauma. And honestly, I don't love that. But I do see where people are coming from, especially for people who are coming to reading after a very long time or are getting back into reading or are reading as a hobby for the first time because of romantasy. I think that's amazing. I do appreciate romance, romantasy, and just a lot of these like popular books for getting people into reading. But there is this sort of moment between people discovering these very popular things because of social trends, of seeing everyone and their mom talk about this specific book or whatever, and feeling the peer pressure to like join along. And then they read those things and then either they love them or they hate them. But there is an element of those who love them chasing the same feeling in every other book that they look for. And so they only sort of stay in this one kind of vein of reading. And then there are the people who discover these books and do not enjoy them and then sort of give up on reading or are struggling to sort of break out of the peer pressure popularity effect of, book talk and just the hyped books and just what publishing is pushing at us, and they can't quite find the books that they love. And there is this element of like these women in these romantasy books having more agency and, being kick-ass and badass and fighting off the evils and not being put in this position of having awful things happen to them, a passive person who is just standing by while a man goes and fights things. And I think a lot of traditional fantasy, a lot of fantasy prior to the last like 20 years was very much these male-dominated narratives where women were just kind of accessories or only there for, random sex scenes or like side romances that weren't very deep. And there's definitely an element of romantasy bridging the gap between romance and fantasy and sort of allowing for the escapism of fantasy, but also injecting some of the female dominated essence of the romance genre into fantasy. And I think I appreciate romantasy for doing that, but I think romantasy as like a word, as a genre is like not anything new particularly. It's definitely more of a marketing term, I would say, for books that are in this fantasy realm that have female-centric narratives and, female main characters, and then also have strong subplots or main plots of romance. And that's not necessarily something that is new. Like, a lot of YA fantasy used to be like that, and I think if you looked back on a lot of those, like, you would technically consider them romantasies, but I do think there has been a connotation that has been added to romantasy that it's always going to be smutty, which it isn't necessarily all the time. And so there's that bridge between, what a YA fantasy was and how romantasy sort of is the adult version of that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't consider those YA fantasies romantasy. Now, with all this in mind, I've been hearing this sort of argument that people who criticize romantasy are being misogynistic, and I've heard that argument levied against romance books as well, and just this fact that, a lot of these narratives that are written by women and feature women are getting flack for not being serious or not having substance to them, but really it's just people being misogynistic and shitting on women. And in some cases, I think this is partly true, but for the most part, I think there's a lot wrong with romantasy that is equally wrong with the rest of publishing and just any other genre and just generally the world. But it is so obvious and strange in romantasy. Just starting off with the overall whiteness of romantasy, it is staggering. And I think most of the romantasy books that are very popular that were, nominated for Goodreads awards and just the ones that everyone's talking about are mainly by white authors or are by authors of color but feature white main characters. And this is a phenomena I've seen in romance, and especially in like older sort of mass market paper bound Harlequin romances where these authors write these romances, but very often they are white characters even if the author is a person of color. And even beyond the whiteness of romantasy, there is such an emphasis on heterosexual relationships and reinforcing sort of these gender norms that I think works against the genre itself, and in some ways reinforces a lot of the things that we see in male-dominated old school fantasies. If we turn to people like Sarah J. Maas with her very popular series, she is so obsessed with this concept of mates, of this idea of like almost animalistic mating and pairing up and making sure that every female character has a male counterpart that she must be with, that she is fated to be with, and that otherwise her life is essentially incomplete. And it's so fascinating to me because often these like relationships are kind of like forced into these situation. And I remember reading the 4th book in the series, and then that's where I stopped, where it was so obvious that a side character was getting forced into this sort of mating situation, and it was in no way a organic romance story. I've noticed how a lot of romantasies, employ this enemies to lovers situation, which I think can be really fun, and I absolutely adore that. But sometimes I think it gets into these weird territories of just the setup of these characters being in these roles, taking the place of actually building any chemistry between these characters. A lot of times these romantasies sort of lean into these fantasy tropes and use them exclusively to drive the romances forward versus actually showing any sort of connection between these characters, which is one way I think romantasy fails a lot in comparison to traditional romances. If these books are meant to be feminist fantasies, as people say, I feel like there's just such a strong focus placed onto the romances versus any of the character development or, the main characters themselves. Yes, they're being badass, but what does that even mean? And is our definition of what a strong female character is predicated on sort of these male traits of being strong, of fighting, of battling and using some sort of physical prowess or physical ability? Truly, the few times that I've picked up multiple like romantasies, I have just been so disappointed by the lack of character to these main characters. And I think some of this sort of leans into the self-inserty nature of fandom in a way, and this sense that a lot of people who are coming to these books want to imprint themselves into this story. They want to put themselves into this situation, this romantic situation, and having a character who is very distinct, who has a very distinct personality, traits to them, and even background or heritage, in some ways works against this ability for people to just mindlessly self-insert. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of self-insert, it's essentially this like term from fan fiction when people would write these, stories based off of other fandoms or, books, movies, whatever, fan fiction, where you would have a main character who is a self-insert. So it is a mainly bland main character who doesn't have any sort of defining traits to them, so that you as a reader can insert yourself into the story as if you are experiencing this romance or this situation with the other characters, with the love interest, etc. And this is not a knock at fanfiction. Guys, I love fanfiction. I wrote fanfiction for many years and I love fanfiction. And I think there is a time and a place and a reason for those types of stories. So I don't think there's any problem with that. But I do think it's interesting to see that sort of concept kind of come to play in these romantasy books, where we have these very bland, straight, white, female main characters who all seem like cookie cutter versions of each other, and who you could ultimately let slip from your mind and instead insert yourself into this story so that you are with the fairy king, the demon king, the warrior, and having all of the fun fairy sex. I'm sure I'm already pissing some people off, which is totally fair and fine. I'm not here to totally shit on the genre, but I do think the self-inserty aspect of some romantasies also ties into why it is such a white genre and why it is such a heterosexual genre. I think there's some stats on romantasy being very, very popular with millennial women. And I find that kind of interesting because I feel like as someone who's a zillennial between millennial and, Gen Z, I can see the differences between the two generations. And I do feel like Gen Z readers are much more open to actually having main characters and people who are different from them and engaging with more diversity. Whereas I think in some ways there is an aspect of this millennial condition where you grew up with Harry Potter and all these popular fandom series, and you want to be the one who, is the chosen one and the one who gets the letter from Hogwarts. And I think it's this condition of wanting to be chosen that also then sort of creates this situation of wanting to insert yourself into these stories. And obviously this doesn't apply to all millennial women. I am not trying to attack any sort of group, but there is a sort of trend within these communities and these generations that is sort of hard to ignore. It's interesting to me that queerness is so not found in romantasy, because I think it kind of threatens this concept and ability to just mindlessly insert yourself into this story, especially obviously for straight women. Earlier this year, I read a really amazing romantasy book by a South Asian author that is also full of queer representation and tackles Hindu mythology and just some of the queerness in that, and just took a really interesting stance. And that was The Legend of Menaka by Kritika H. Rao. I highly recommend it. It's absolutely fantastic, but it's just so startling to me how little attention this book got, because it's not your traditional romantasy where you can just self-insert, and it doesn't have, this concept of dark power dynamics that people are obsessed with, which I also find kind of absurd, this whole growling and animalisticness. I mean, I get people are into that, but I think it's just so wild to me how pervasive it is within the genre and how that seems to be the overarching method of writing and having these characters interact. Why are they all reinforcing these alpha male sort of tropes? And is that not sort of another shadow of these sort of traditional misogynistic fantasies? I get that she's strong outside of the sheets, but is it wrong for her to also be in control while she's in the sheets? I know some of these stories do have her in control, and I understand that. That's fair, and I'm happy to see that. But I do think there's this element of alpha male power dynamics and this idea that these women are sort of paired with them and destined to be with them. And in some ways, these characters don't always respect each other, which I think is an interesting concept and kind of horrifying. But anyways, I was talking about The Legend of Menaka, which I absolutely love and you should really read. But this book is a retelling of a legend in Hindu mythology, and it follows an apsara, or a celestial dancer in Hindu mythology, named Menaka. And essentially she is one of these celestial dancers who is one of the agents of the king of gods, and she's often sent down to earth to seduce this or that enemy of the gods and sort of turn things in their favor. But Menaka in the book is sort of grappling with an unrequited love for another celestial dancer who she's known for a very long time, and this desire to stay in the celestial city with her and not have to do these missions. And then she's also struggling with her being a a, celestial dancer and having to be this seductress and to convince these marks to fall in love with her, but then dealing with the moral implications of that and how she's using, seduction and love as a weapon against them. And I found it to be super, super interesting. And later in the book, she's sort of sent down to seduce this monk who has angered the gods. And it's a really interesting dynamic. But what I loved about this was that he was not this sort of dark, and absurd male main character who's morally gray just because he has trauma. He was an interesting multifaceted main character who had layers to him. And I think a lot of male characters in romantasies that I've seen don't actually have that much depth to them. They have some strange trauma that explains why they're kind of mean to the main character and kind of an asshole, but doesn't actually justify it, I think. But in this book, it was just like nice to see how Menaka, exercises her own agency. She is grappling with these different moral conundrums, and she's also queer AF. And I think that that was so wonderful to see, and also just made for like a much more interesting and unique story. And honestly, I just finished this book and was like, oh my god, this is like such a wonderful example of what romantasy could be, I think, and what I would love to see more of in romantasy. Less of these cookie cutter stories that often feature, white main characters, and more of a diverse and robust suite of books that tackle both fantasy and romance tropes and just allow for some rich storytelling. Because I think dismissing romantasy overall as just something that is just smut or just for the girls or just, absolute drivel and not of any literary value is super reductive and not actually true. I think romantasy has a huge potential to be of great literary value, because I think there's an element of romance in how it has these set aspects to it, having this happily ever after, that allows for a lot of different exploration in the rest of the book, because you have the comfort of knowing you're going to get your happily ever after, but you can also interrogate so many other themes and topics and ideas. And it's one of the reasons why I love romance as a genre, and I love seeing romances written by authors of color that tackle so many different topics. So I think romance as a genre has made some of those strides in terms of interrogating other topics, but I think romantasy, with these new labels that it's been given and the way that the book publishing industry has sort of jumped on this trend and is bent on just recycling the same types of stories to just make money, we have ended up in this weird situation where we aren't really getting the full potential of this genre. And I think people who love romantasy or who have gotten into reading because of romantasy have the potential to love more diverse ranges of stories within romantasy if they were actually published. And again, like I said in my last video, like a lot of these things are not actually the fault of readers necessarily. It's actually the fault of publishing and how it's always chasing after replicating these big books and these trends and trying to just make money, because publishing is in the end a business, but it forgets how much it shapes the fabric of our thoughts and feelings about the world and our perspectives. And although there's many people who are reading romantasy for this self-inserty sort of feeling, I think it's reductive to say that they're only reading for that. I think many of them probably would enjoy a book with a more interesting main character who is doing things differently than they may have done things, and who falls in love with a non-alpha male love interest, or even another woman or someone who is not a, cis man. I think there's a lot of potential for that, but we just need to see those stories published. We need to see those stories given the platform. And although as readers, we don't have as much power as publishers, I do think we have the power in what we choose to read, in resisting against the marketing by these publishers, and to actually go out of our way to pick up books from diverse perspectives. I've been also feeling that there's like this element of sort of coolness that's being associated with romantasy and sort of reading smut books on Book Talk, and sort of this pride that people have with that. And I think that's amazing. And I think it's so interesting to see a traditionally nerdy hobby like reading, which when I was growing up, like was, a nerdy hobby. Like you were kind of a geek if you were reading all the time, and if that was like the main thing that you love to do. But now reading has become this sort of weird, cozy mainstream hobby. And I think COVID had a lot to do with that. But I also think that it's entered into this realm of just escapism and just people doing it for the entertainment, which has started to encroach on some of the intellectualism of reading as a thing in and of itself. That's another topic I feel like that I may tackle in another video. I do feel like it kind of relates to romantasy, and also part of the reason why we get a lot of these same cookie cutter romantasies is because a lot of people do not want to engage with any further intellectualism, any further themes beyond escaping into a fantastical world and escaping into a perfect and lusty and fun romance, whatever their standards of fun are, and forgetting about everything else. And again, escapism has its place in the world, and I think it's very important, and I think it's also how we process a lot of things in our real world. But I do think that when you're constantly escaping into something that is a political statement in and of itself, because it chooses to put you in a world that does not require any friction on your part and allows you to forget other people and their suffering and all of the things that you could be doing, that is a bit suspect. I don't know. It's interesting to see how people, engage with fiction. Anyways, I know there's going to be a lot of people in my comments here to yell at me, and that is completely fine. You are welcome to. This is a discussion. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic and on romantasy. Are you a romantasy reader? Have I completely misrepresented you? I would love to know. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong. I don't mind. These are all my opinions. That doesn't mean that I am completely right, nor, the source of truth. I love to be proven wrong, and I would love to hear more, opinions. I personally haven't read as many romantasies as, maybe someone else. So I would love to hear your recommendations. But again, I'd love to hear some diverse recommendations. There are maybe a handful of romantasy books that are by authors of color or that have some sort of queer representation. And so I would love to be proven wrong and be told that there are more. And I would love to see those recommendations. So if you have them, leave them down below. Other people can also read them. And I'd love to do a video reading some diverse romantasy books. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of you here. And thank you to all of the new people who are sticking around and here for the conversations. I love doing discussion videos like this, so if you have another topic that you'd like me to tackle, to talk about, then let me know down below. Leave me your questions, leave me your topics, and I will see you in my next video. And thank you so much to my Bindery members for supporting me and my channel and making all of this possible. And please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!